moving on a little bit more towards, actual OWL stuff. I think once again, should start with a little bit of Toronto. So I want to get your thoughts, Wool. We talked about it recently, but Toronto let go of everybody, just re-sign Logics. Does that make sense to you? Would you have rather them, kept a couple of other people like, Kariv? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the issue with Toronto Defiant is that one thing they did incredibly well last season, I would say the end of the second season, but more importantly, last season, was really building a roster that appealed to your fan base. And I think had COVID not been around and sort of the homestand sort of situation environment sort of gone through the entire season, I think that would have reaped a lot more rewards than it did, because you got such a great sort of fan support and sort of backing behind the players because of how you sort of market them and sort of sell the team with your players and all that sort of idea.
Yeah, totally agree.
But as it ended up this year and now looking ahead to next year, there's no real point trying to improve the brand or improve sort of that loyalty around sort of local talents, when actually the most important thing really right now with it being online is trying to get results.
Mm-hmm.
So I can understand why they now want to go in a completely different direction. So I can understand why they've now dropped most of the roster. It's interesting though seeing them keep Logics, because that shows that they are going to stay either Western or mixed, most likely now fully Western. I'm happy to see that, because I think too many teams that underperform from one season immediately press the delete button and then just immediately go, well, we now have to go fully Korean.
Yeah.
And as we've seen in certain situations, that doesn't always work unless you've got the right coach in place, and then also the right scouting in place to get the right Korean talent over to it. So I'm happy to see them stay Western. Obviously, just signing Logics, it's hard to say how they're going to go. I think Logics, he had an okay season. It's kind of, as I say, it's hard to say with the Toronto players, because I thought a lot of their performances were actually all right. Like, they didn't play a horrible season like Vancouver or Boston.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time they played well, but just kept on losing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to say sort of who of those players were sort of good enough to keep and build around. But it's an interesting direction for sure. But now I need to sort of back it up with sort of quite aggressive moves, sort of moving forward to put around Logics and see whether Logics is someone they actually want to be starting, or whether they're going to use him as more of an impact sub, kind of like how they used him a bit this year as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with like a lot of the things that you're saying. I initially thought that I think in esports it's becoming really apparent that like I think a fan's attachment to players are more apparent than in like some other traditional sports, for instance, right? So I actually do think that having some cohesiveness with your team over year after year is really important. Now, obviously, I don't think like, oh, just like run it back forehead, because like you're just gonna lose. So I was really surprised when they let Kariv go. I thought that the play probably would have been doing a mixed roster. I thought you could have started that with like Logics and Kariv, for instance, and then maybe because Kariv is like essentially bilingual, and then maybe worked around that and try to go with some Korean contenders talent and then maybe some established Western talent. Well, I do like the fact that it does seem like they're staying Western only, because I think it's like staying pretty consistent with their brand from like last year. The problem is like, well, the Western talent that's elite is elite, right? Like there's some really good Western talent out there, and we saw it again going back to the World Cup with Team USA winning. The depth is just nowhere near as it is in like Korea, for instance. So I think because you're going to see a couple different teams try to go NA only, like probably Houston, or they might go mixed, like Vancouver, for instance, that this top tier Western talent might be too spread out for you to build a winning team. And while it might be nice again to have some fans on your back if you pick up some popular names, it's like, man, I can't do another season where we're a bottom 5 team again. You know what I mean? Like, it's been too long, man. I missed stage 1 2019. Like, please just give us that. So I like keeping Logics. I think he was one of our better players. I think when he's on and he's at his peak, he generally is like an elite hit scan, which is like pretty hard to find. And if you do find them, you usually keep them. So I do think for Western talent, he's actually one of the better hit scan talents out there. I think, KSP deserves a shout. I'm kind of going off the top of my head here. Obviously, Shockwave looked promising, but doesn't have the track record that Logic does. But Logic has been one of the most consistent, higher performing Western hit scans out there. So I like keeping him. It was just sort of like I was really surprised to see Kareev go, and I was surprised to see Beast and Agilities not at least get like a substitute offer, sort of, and to be totally let go as well. Because I do agree that the Canadian flag is less important, but I thought Beast showed moments where he was elite, and so did Agilities.
Yeah, yeah, you're definitely right. And once again, I think we talked to Adam, and he said that he wanted the roster to stay Western so that he can make, still have connections with the roots of Toronto. And you know what? Toronto, I think, still got, top 5, was it, in, donations or earnings or something like that.
Yeah, like
even
jersey
without
sales.
homestands. Bottom 5, performance top 5, and wow, holy crap. So imagine what we do if we actually had that. So, definitely good to get your kind of opinion on that. So, well, do you have any? There's been a bunch of moves, so far in Overwatch in terms of people moving. What are the kind of apart from Toronto, the other biggest, pickups and let goes that you kind of popped up on your radar in the past, couple of weeks?
I mean, I'm sure we'll get to some other ones a little later on, but just today, the moves by the Dallas Fuel taking over or bringing over Rush, Sparkle, and Hanbin.
That was insane.
Sort of bringing back sort of that Element Mystic core.
Yeah.
From
and I like
2
when
years ago.
you say that, because it's funny. They also actually, at the same time post like open tryouts too.
Yeah. No, because I mean they're trying to fill out that roster. I mean, I'm sure Dallas is sitting there like, hey, we just spent all of our money on Sparkle, Doha, and Hanbin and Rush. Like, now we got to fill them out. And like, I don't know. I mean, Envy has money obviously to buy other talent, but at the end of the day, like, it's gonna be tough for them. Just like, just go out there and sign, Meg Forehead. Like, why don't you just go pick up Violet? It's like, man, how much money do these guys have available left to spend? So maybe they are trying to find some like hidden gems to sort of fill out that roster. So what are your thoughts on the moves then, Wall? Because like that was huge. Like, how good do you think that team's going to be? Like, what sort of players do you think they're gonna try to fill out that roster with? You know what I mean? Like, where do you see the Dallas Fuel of 2020, 2021 ending up?
I mean, there's 2 ways they can go about it. I mean, one of the things I found interesting is that there's a couple of Element Mystic players back from that Contenders Gauntlet run who haven't been picked up, even for our last season. And it'll be interesting to see with sort of now the coaching staff also together with the sort of core that was there, whether they try and sort of completely run it back and sort of bring back that entire whole roster from back in the day, or whether they try to sort of bring in other talents to build around it. I mean, the open tryout thing, I think you're seeing nearly every team sort of posting their sort of version of open tryouts thing. So I think that's quite a normal thing that's come into play. I think that's also under a bit of pressure to look like you're not giving anyone a chance. I think it does create a bit of a divide between Overwatch League and Tier 2 if you're not even giving players a chance. And I think we've seen through the tryout system, there are some people who are, performing well enough to get their sort of get the coach's attention and then getting brought on because of it. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see. I mean, the thing with Dallas is that, and the MV org, I mean, we've seen their success in the CDL with sort of how that's gone. I mean, they clearly are loaded. I mean, there's no underestimation to say how much money they've got available to them. I mean, also it did seem also like Paris potentially coming under a bit of hard times financially. Yeah. It didn't feel like a move they had to make, but it more felt like an offer they couldn't refuse. Yeah.
And we've seen it with their CDL team too. I mean, you mentioned like Dallas' CDL team. Obviously, Chris and I do the Ultra podcast as well. The Paris Legion are the only team that has signed. Like, they don't have anybody announced for next year, and we know that they could have had certain people, but they're like not. It was too much money. And the CDL Intel tweeted out that like the requirements are like everybody needs to be 50K, right? Which is like the league minimum for the CDL, which has way crazier contracts than the Overwatch League did. So I do think that this was sort of a money thing with them.
I didn't know that the same. What's the org that owns both these teams?
I forget. It's something I'd have to look it up, but it is the same. It's the same. It's the same. It's the same org. It's the same organization that owns both Paris Eternal and also the Paris Legion.
Well, maybe they I don't know. Maybe they are having a tough time bringing in money this year.
Well, for sure,
because of the brand.
I mean, the home stands would have been huge for them. I mean, the French crowds we've seen in the past are massive. I really liked what they did this year as well, which is why I'm really disappointed to see that they've sort of taken this route. I really liked how all the French players they kept, even though I actually thought keeping the French player was a bad idea back in sort of the preseason.
Yeah.
They ended up all really raising that sort of their level. And that's also why I think Rush is such a big pickup for Dallas also.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people forget because obviously when Sparkle came, like how much that team leveled up to then win the Summer Showdown, how well Hanbin performed all season. So it kind of looked like sort of the Element Mystic rookies coming in and sort of popping off. But it's also just how Rush was able to get those sort of French players and even sort of the other sort of more seen as sort of like poor performing players from the year before, how he was just able to level them up and have such a strong start to the season when everyone thought they were going to be pretty rubbish until Sparkle arrived.
Yeah, soon had a really good look. Nico was really impressed. I thought Nico was done.
Yeah.
Nico and Benbest I thought were done.
Exactly, yeah.
And I knew FD would be good. Like, he had a really good, World Cup performance, and I rated him pretty highly. When Chris and I did our, who should Toronto pick up last year, FD was actually on the top of my list for main supports behind Funny Astro. And he looked really good, especially on the Lucio. But yeah, dude, Nico and Benbest, I thought were done. I mean, no offense to them. So good for them for, proving us wrong, because Nico came in there with his May looked really good. Even his Doomfist and stuff like that at times looked really good. His Sombra and Soon looked really good. And Benbest, aside from the monkey, like his Orisa was like actually like really good. Like, you know what I mean? Like in the upper echelon of Orisa players, I thought. So like that really did impress me. And I like that combination. That's like the best way to do a mixed roster. Get like elite Korean talent and then follow it up with like your hometown sort of your French talent with them, right? Like that was the best way to do a mixed roster in my opinion, because you got the best of both worlds. You got results and you also got like French fans. Yeah, so I mean, I could maybe have seen
Hanbin. How it did translate to money.
Yeah, but like at some point then you got to bring like some marketing staff, right? Like you got to obviously nobody in esports right now, especially in the Overwatch League, is profitable. So I mean, you're not gonna, you're kind of playing the long game at this point. And I thought maybe you give up Hanbin if you think you can bring in Pokpo and sort of round out that like French sort of talent, and then maybe bring in like another flex support player. I guess if Fielder wasn't signed, or bring him to whatever it's called. Did you bring another main tank? I don't know. Like I don't know what the play was, but Hanbin maybe made a little bit of sense, even though I think he was really good and deserved to be on that team. But to lose like Sparkle and Rush especially is like crippling. And we don't know what's going to happen to Exy, but I mean, obviously if you see those players go, I'd be kind of surprised if he stayed.
Yeah, it's weird at the minute because it seems from his tweets that there are no plans for him to join the others in sort of going there.
Yeah.
Which at the same time isn't as much of a surprise as people might make it out to be, because looking back at that old Element Mystic roster, whilst Exy did get some playtime, it was the Sparkle Doha sort of duo.
Yeah.
Like that was the duo that Rush built up and put together and had as his DPS duo. And whilst potentially they're not as flexible, sort of especially on sort of those hit scan roles.
Yeah.
Like those are his number one, or were his number one and number two. So whilst Rush always goes in a package with Sparkle everywhere. Yeah. We've seen that now. Whilst those two going across, I mean, Hanbin's a massive pickup, I think, because I thought he was someone who wasn't really mentioned in the Rookie of the Year conversation, but I think should have been.
I agree.
Because I thought he had such an impactful year alongside Krong. I think he was not as good as Krong. I think Krong still probably had the better overall year.
Yeah.
I would still say he should have been mentioned, whereas normally it was just Krong off tank and then that was it.
He did, but man, I kind of agree with you. Like, I think obviously Krong had a really good year, but he also, I think, played on a more well-rounded team. Like, I think when you look at like how Paris had looked when they were losing to the Defiant in their first game of the season versus like how they looked as soon as Hanbin came in, right? Even before Sparkle, like that made such an impact for that team. And obviously Fielder came in, really like rounded them out, but I think Hanbin's going to be really good next year. Like I rate him really highly. I think he is in that elite echelon of like off tanks.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the point really that Dallas Fuel fans should take is that on paper, they should be a playoff-bound roster, assuming they then make decent pickups and like actually build around the rest of this core. I mean, at this point, though, you do have to wonder how they're going to screw it up. I mean, that's the problem with Dallas. You can't really, you can have hope now, but you can't really have the faith that it's all going to come through and be successful like it should do, just based on what's happened in the past. I mean, season 1 is your prime example, and also the thing with Sparkle is that look at how it turned out with Effect and Decay. You know, they almost have like a curse with how sort of superstar DPS talents sort of, whilst they still perform there, they end up sort of ending their careers there and going elsewhere after sort of flaming out.
Man, imagine if Decay was still on this roster. Oh my god, like XE is good, but imagine if you had Decay, Doha, and Sparkle.
I mean, he's a free agent, so that's something to keep an eye on as well. Because
I was gonna say, who would you, if you're the Dallas Fuel, then who would you round out that talent with? Because it's such a good talent, but you're right. If it's a Widow Tracer meta, like they just lose, right? Like I mean, I think Sparkle and Doha are great, but if it's Widow Tracer, like there's teams that have better Widow Tracers in the league, right? Who do you try to round out, you know, that roster with?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, it looks like Dallas are willing to give the keys fully to Rush, which would imply to me they do just go with a full Korean roster. We don't sort of have any sort of meddling with keeping any sort of Western or mixed aspect to it.
I agree.
I mean, the big positions really are obviously you need your support line, and you also need that main tank at the very least, just to make that sort of starting 6. Obviously, you want to look for that hit scan specialist, but I think as Shock showed with Arms last year, I actually think you can probably find a gem of hit scan somewhere. Whether you
open
look
tryouts
in the league, whether you look in open tryouts, whether you look in contenders, you could probably find someone else. One player who I'm interested to see, I mean, I don't necessarily think he would 100% start if you brought someone else, but I think Pokpo would be a nice fit, because I think he's a really underrated main tank and really got underutilized by the Atlanta Reign because of how much they sort of kept running sort of that Gator and Hawk.
Yeah.
The other thing with Pokpo is that he's also another former member of Element Mystic, so he has that previous connection with Rush, with some of the old Element Mystic players.
Yeah.
So if they liked him back then, that's obviously a potential avenue they could look into.
That's actually a good call.
Agents. As I say, I think you can get better, but I think he's definitely he'll make a solid start for sure.
Oh, I think he's actually a really good player. He's established, and when you looked at him, you know, back in the GOATs, he was one of the better Reinhardts in the league, and obviously his Monkey's really good. We saw that when they played him on Monkey this year. I do think that if you're going to go hard, I mean, obviously not Element Mystic, but like your Mags and your Yak Punks from Korean contenders. I would love to see Yak Punk back in the league, especially with the success that he had seen on O2 Blast this year. And obviously being a former Toronto Defiant. So I think that would be a pretty good, like, hey, rookie to sort of like Meg and Hanbin could be a really, really deadly tank line, in my opinion. I think you definitely need a hit scan. So XC, Decay. I'm not familiar enough with Korean contenders to know if there's any like former Element Mystic, you know, hit scans or the current ones who are like really, really elite. I think it's going to be the support that they really need to hit that support line. And there's so much talent available. I kind of don't see them missing because there's so many good flex supports, like, you know, Shoe's available, Kariv's available. You know, AimGod might not be on that level, but you've seen that he can play certain heroes at like a really, really high level, or you just go to contenders and you try to find one. Like, I think there's so many good talent for your supports that, assuming the main support position is well rounded up from like contenders, I think that this is going to be a nasty team next year.
Well, it should be. Otherwise, the fans are gonna regret things real quick.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, great conversation about the Dallas Fuel, but you know what? You're from the UK. You know, I know one of your favorite teams from chatting before is Seoul, but London. What do you think? What else do you think that, you know, they should do in the future? You know, any ideas or thoughts, you know, for both of you guys on whether or not who they should be picking up in that sense?
I mean, it's really weird with London because they're sending really mixed messages at the minute. They've obviously still got players like, I mean, is it Glister, Bernard, Sanguinar?
Technically, yeah.
They're all still signed with the team.
Yeah, before they sell them to Seoul.
Well,
no, I'm kidding. Sorry, continue. Yeah.
I mean, I'll get onto that. They got them signed, so I mean, they're obviously not releasing the players clearly.
Yeah.
So if they are going to get rid of them and go away from a Korean roster, they would have to trade or sell them or mutually part ways. But the bringing in of Nuki as general manager implies that they're definitely, and also from, I don't know if you've read that article that accompanied, it definitely gave the impression that they wanted to transition to a more, not necessarily EU centric, but at least Western/EU centric roster moving forward. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, I think they probably should transition to an EU-centric roster, especially now that they've got rid of the coaching staff and can, start anew. I mean, the most obvious place to start would be Hurricane, clearly. Just almost bringing up the entire Hurricane roster and coaching staff to at least have that sort of established base to then build around. At that point, you then do have to offload the Korean talent. I mean, I'm sure, for me, Glister to Seoul just seems like a perfect fit, match made in heaven.
Man, so
given
nasty.
It would be very nasty, and given his previous relationship with Gen G as well, it just seems to make
even Benar.
So, I was going to say even Benar would make a lot of sense, and given the fact they dealt last year with the whole gesture of profit deal, and even in terms of sending Glister over to London in the first place from the Gen G organization, you've already seen that sort of pre-established relationship. So it wouldn't surprise me to see that sort of carry forward. I mean, they could go mixed roster, but I feel like outside of Benar and Glister and to a certain degree Sanguinar, you saw the issue with going for just that sort of very just rookie. It was what I was saying earlier about just going full Korean and sort of rolling the dice on that. Unless you do have those really good scouted talents, a lot of the players you'll see just underperform and you don't really get anywhere. I mean, London themselves though were unlucky because I think they would have been sort of a proper mid-table side had they actually just stayed in North America and not moved over to APAC. I mean, you saw their start to the season was actually really impressive for what their roster. Everyone thought their roster sort of had what their potential was at the start of the year. I mean, my thoughts right now is that they'll probably go Western, and that should start with the introduction of Hurricane, given how dominant they've been in EU contenders. You're not really going to look much further than them in terms of the best sort of European talents available.
Is Sanguinar a main support or flex support? I'm blanking right now.
Sanguinar's main, unless I'm dumb.
I think you can make a pretty good mixed roster with the British here, because I mean, I don't want to knock people, but I mean, obviously I believe Kellex is British Hurricanes main support right now, and I actually think Kellex had a pretty disappointing year for Toronto Defiant this year. That's the one player who I think we can really speak to. I did think that that you saw an improvement with Cruz, and obviously part of that was the leadership capabilities, but I think part of that was also just like I do think Cruz on certain heroes sort of performed a little bit better. So I think if you had Sanguinar being that main support, Glister on the hit scan, and then Benar as their off tank, and then you subbed on it's Haiti, right? Who's British Hurricanes main tank? Hattie.
Hattie.
Yeah. And I think Hattie's pretty good. And you round that out with some EU talent. I actually think that's not something I thought of. I was just so certain that like Benar and Glister going to Seoul, and then Sanguinar maybe going to Dallas was actually somebody who I thought might happen. But you talking about like keeping those guys and then surrounding them with EU talent, like a boombox flex support, for instance, like that's actually kind of spicy. I sort of like that.
It could be, but then you need the right coach. I think that's the biggest thing with mixed rosters.
Yeah, you're right.
The coach is so important, and I think you're in for a problematic time because, as you said, I think with the coaches you see, you need someone like Rush to a certain extent, like KDG. You need someone with experience of having a mixed roster, or at least with sort of the presence and power as a coach to sort of command a mixed roster. So I think it's very easy to lose either the Western side or the Korean side of a mixed roster if you don't look after them properly.
I agree.
You see, you've seen that with Dallas. I think that's been one of their biggest issues with the Koreans they brought in. They haven't really looked after them that well.
Yeah.
They've either gotten homesick or just haven't felt their sort of needs have been sort of delivered upon. So I think London would be safer just almost selling off whatever Korean assets they still have and committing to that sort of EU option. Because I also believe the Hurricane players all certainly deserve a shot at the OWL level, just given how dominant and how well they're performing, and how well some of them have been performing in contenders for now 2 years, or even more than 2 years. So I think that's probably the way I would personally lean.
Yeah.
But it's definitely one just to sort of keep an eye on, especially sort of looking over the next couple of weeks.
Who would you round that out with if you bring British Hurricane on? Because there's so much talent available. I mean, obviously, I think if you just take the 6 from British Hurricane, put them in, I think that they would struggle a little bit, because I do think that there is a little bit of a gap between, the top tier Overwatch League teams and the British Hurricane. But I think that they have an opportunity where they can look at other people to really round out that roster. Is there anybody who really stands out who you'd like to see, British Hurricane plus this person, this person, this person? Or are you of the mindset that no, man, British Hurricane has been so dominant contenders, they can walk in and sort of be a playoff team? I don't think anybody thinks it's going to be a championship team, but a playoff dark horse sort of team.
I don't think there would be. Well, I think there would be. I'd describe them as a play-in team.
Yeah.
So not top 6, maybe in that sort of 7 to 12 range. I do think they have the potential to be that, especially their tank line. I'm really high on their tank line.
Yeah.
And I think even though Kelix may have underperformed a bit in his time during the Overwatch League, I think starting at the World Cup last year, and then moving on into contenders this year, I think he's shown a lot of growth and development and improvement from his time before. So I think he definitely deserves another shot. I think looking at the sort of Overwatch League free agents, I think you've got a couple of just really interesting pieces you could add as sort of just veterans and experience. I mean, with it being the UK team, you could even have Cruz and Boombox as sort of an optional support line. I mean, as much as Poco to Paris makes a ton of sense, I almost wouldn't hate to see us with them going to London, assuming you had a sort of EU sort of London or Hurricane London. Having Poco and Molf as your options for off-tank, for me, is incredible for a Western off-tank duo.
I think the issue is Molf just wouldn't play. I think that's unless it's a double off-tank meta, that would be my problem. I think Poco's really good. I think Molf's good too.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. They're both really good, but I think they also excel on different heroes slightly as well. I think you play Poco for the Zarya, you play Molf for the Sigma, and then sort of depends on who's you prefer in that sort of diva role.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you have Poco specialize on sort of the ball and the ball and the Zarya, whilst you have Molf with the diva and the Sigma. But I think there's definitely some. It's more the DPS. I don't know where exactly you would go. I mean, there's other contenders' talent you could potentially look at. I'm just trying to look through the our free agents to see if anyone's catching my eyes in terms of.
Boombox would be cool to have on that team. Yeah.
Yeah. So him as a support for sure.
Yeah.
It's more the
DPS. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
The DPS.
I'm trying to think of British, but I'm KSP's obviously not going anywhere, so it's
maybe not even British, but it'd be interesting if you added someone like Linkser.
Linkser is a good shout.
I think Linkser would be a pretty interesting piece on that sort of roster. I mean, you could make something really, really interesting and intriguing with that sort of British Hurricane core surrounded by sort of OWL veterans.
Yeah.
Who've been in the league for a few years, but have not really stuck with their team. So that's certainly one to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Those are definitely good points in that sense.
Hi guys, so I know that this is sort of in the middle of the episode that you're currently watching, but the problem was we had filmed that with WOLL. Great episode, by the way. Very thankful for him. The issue was Toronto Defiant has since decided to make a major announcement by signing the head coach, formerly of the Philadelphia Fusion, formerly of the Seoul Dynasty, KDG. So we're just here to give our quick little thoughts about that as well. Obviously, it's a Toronto Defiant podcast. We can't not talk about this issue. I'm Spencer. You know that, Chris. Let's just jump right into this. So, Chris, obviously KDG as a coach, I like the move. I think it's a good move. But I think I'm more optimistic about what it signifies as opposed to the actual move itself. I'm not sure if you're sort of in a similar boat, and I'll elaborate later on. But I just want to hear your initial thoughts of this KDG signing from the Toronto Defiant.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. So, initial thoughts when I kind of leads me to compare them to the 2 coach pickups from our previous season. Feifei from last year and, man, what was his name from season 2? Bishop. And already, on paper, he's already, to me, a better pickup than them.
Yeah, no disrespect, but I agree.
No disrespect, obviously. But, Feifei had a somewhat disappointing season with Paris before coming to Toronto.
Agreed.
Bishop kind of had a decent stage, and then so he's made Philly a top 3 team in NA, debatably a top 3-4 team in all of the leagues. So that's already a positive sign. He joined up with Seoul, and they're pretty decent too. So right out of the gate, comparatively to other pickups we had in the past, it's a good sign.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when we first signed Feifei, we came on this show and we were sort of hesitant, where I was like, I don't know why you want to replicate 2019 Paris Eternal. That didn't make a ton of sense to me. This is a very different story, right? This is somebody who came from the Philadelphia Fusion after an incredibly successful season. Now, I don't want to say it's a gripe, because I don't want to, talk too negatively about a coach who overall I do think is like a top 10 coach in the league, and one of the better sought after coaches in the free agent market. I still stand by, I think Junk Buck was number one who I wanted for this team, but Houston got him, so that's fine. I think other than Junk Buck and 9K and Rush, he was right there in the upper echelon of coaches available. So I'm pretty happy to see that. Philadelphia Fusion had a really good year. Now, I'm a little bit concerned as to like how much of that really was the coaching. I think there was definitely moments throughout the year where I was a little bit, I think you scratched your head a little bit about, some of the stuff that Philly was doing. Obviously, they had a disappointing playoffs, but I don't want to read too much into the playoffs, but I also don't want to read too much into Philadelphia was a top 4 team, therefore he's a top tier coach. Like, the roster in Philadelphia was extremely good. So I'm not saying that it wasn't because of the coach or that the coach didn't provide a lot of value in that sense, but I was watching the Plaid Chat episode and they were talking about how he gets the best out of all of his players. And I mean, I'm not saying that's not true, but also like the players he had available to him were like extremely good players. Like, I think the fact that he was able to turn Sato, Fury, Carpe, Hisu, Ivy, EQO, Funny Astro, and Alarm into a top 3 NA team is like, obviously it's impressive, but at the same time, it's like pretty expected, right? Like I feel like at some point, as long as you didn't like hard throw that team, like they were going to be a top 3, top 4 roster in North America. With that being said, though, he does have a lot of respect amongst the league. A lot of people do talk highly of him. Obviously, in season 2, he was in the Seoul Dynasty, and while that team did kind of underperform in some ways, it also like he also was he wasn't afraid to experiment, right? Like you saw him sort of run that 2-man roster where Seoul Dynasty had a team for Escort and hybrid and stuff like that, and then they had the assault team with the other 6, which was like a really, even though I think some people disagree with it, I at least thought that it was a really cool mentality and a cool approach to have. He's not afraid to sub players out to try to make his roster as good as possible. We saw that with Philadelphia. He also was able to pick up and scout some pretty good talent for the Seoul Dynasty, which leads me to believe that he might be able to scout some pretty good talent for the Toronto Defiant. And then my final point is KDG probably wasn't cheap. And what that means, and hopefully, fingers crossed, ideally signifies, is there are rumors that some teams in this next season are going to be spenders and other teams are going to be sellers. You saw this, the Paris Eternal, right? They are sellers. The Dallas Fuel are buyers. This leads me to believe that the Toronto Defiant are trying to set themselves up to potentially be buyers and for the first time in 3 years, really put forth a contending roster available. Now, whether or not that roster will, 1, actually be contending, or 2, be mixed or Western, we have yet to see. Although I kind of now with KDG starting to lean towards a mixed roster because of 2 reasons. 1, obviously he has a history of doing mixed and all Korean rosters, but also 2, I don't know if you can build a true contender with Western only players unless you actually go out there and get Super and Moth. And I know we had our fun little like, hey, let's try to theorize a roster, but realistically with like LA and Houston kind of doing similar things.
And Moth went to Fuel too.
No, that was that was a bait. That's a fake account.
Damn.
Yeah, everyone's making fun of actual people who got baited by that. So Chris is one of them.
I got baited.
Chris is one of them. Yeah, that's fake. So he didn't. I think unless you actually get Super or Moth, it's going to be hard to build a legitimate contending team from North American talent. I think like, there's just not a good main tank and main support players available, especially with Houston and I think LA knocking at that door. So I'm excited. I'm optimistic. I don't know if it's this massive home run some people make it out to be. Some people say he's a top 3 coach. I'm not sure. But other people are like, well, look at they performed in playoffs. KDG sucks. And I also think that's overreacting too far on the other side. I'm optimistic. I have faith. And overall, I'm happy.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just to note, what Glitch, formerly Spazzo, he was hired on specifically for lots of scouting too. Yeah. So I think with these 2 kind of scouting powerhouses, which are known for scouting, we damn well better put together a good team. Yeah. If we hire 2 scouting coaches and don't put together a decent team, then I'm gonna be like, what? Wait, what?
Yeah.
What were you guys hired on for? So
it's a good point.
I'm hoping we pick up some decent, well-known talent. I'm hoping we actually take a chance at some diamonds in the rough and contenders, and I'm hoping we do.
Yeah, and I think if you're Western only, you're gonna have to for main tank and main support, because I just don't know where else unless you buy FD God, there's your main support player, but otherwise you're really gonna have to try to trial some players and really get some things rolling, because I think in terms of established Western talent, flex support, DPS, and off tanks kind of are pretty much there. Although off tanks, I think Pokpo is actually not a free agent, so we'll see. I kind of thought Pokpo, but Note's still there. But in terms of main tank, especially main support, those two are a little bit more up in the air from established free agent markets who are formerly in the Overwatch League. So again, guys, I'm not going to sit here and I know an F ton about coaching. This is obviously off of what we've heard and their previous reputations throughout the league. Optimistic, excited, but at the end of the day, you never really know until you're actually in the room and see what a coach does. So with that being said, Chris, I have nothing else to add, right? There's only so much we can sort of speculate here. Overall, I think it's exciting. Not only the addition of the coach, but also a sign of things to come for the Toronto Defiant in this upcoming offseason, and I can't wait to cover the team moving forward.
Yeah, you know what? Couldn't have said it better yourself. So, hey, guys, once again, I think we're getting to the end of the video there. So if you like what we have, give us a like, comment, let us know what your thoughts are. Love to chat with you guys in the comments, and subscribe if you really like us. Thank you.
Yeah, and as always, enjoy.